Hello and welcome to School District Data Management for the School Business Official. My name is Matthew Swerdloff and I'll be presenting this session. Just a little bit about myself to start. I'm currently the Director of Technology in the Hendrick Hudson School District in Westchester, New York. I've been in that position for 10 years. I also served as an adjunct faculty member at State University of New York in Buffalo and Western Connecticut State University. And finally, before I was a school administrator, I served as a classroom teacher for 8 years in New York State in grades 4 through 8. If you need to reach me, if you have any follow-up questions or questions about the lesson or anything related, you can reach me at this phone number, 914-257-5170, or you can email me at mswerdloff@gmail.com. And I hope this session is useful to you. Let's begin with an overview of the session just to kind of give you a sense of where we'll be going with this lesson. First, I'll be talking about different types of data and how they're used in schools. I'll be talking about data security and privacy. Obviously, that's a very large topic, and I'll be just touching on it very briefly. Different types of data applications and some of the most common ones that we see in schools. Data reporting requirements, which have become quite onerous in New York State recently. A quick overview of capital projects in New York State and that process. And then I'd like to just touch on a couple of really controversial and newsworthy issues in regards to schools and data issues. So let's start right now talking about different types of data. And really, it's kind of a simple breakdown. I've kind of divided this into 5 large groups of data that you most typically see in school districts. And the first one and the largest one is student data. So this type of data would be anything pertaining to students, including their demographic information, their parental information, their health records, their grades, of course, their enrollment history, all that sort of data that we have been collecting for years in schools on students. The next type of data that is collected is staff data, and this is typically in a separate system than the student data system. This would include things like staff's credentials, staff's tenure status, staff in-service credits and education history, as well as their financial and contact information. Third type of data that's collected often and used in school systems is financial data, and this would be both in terms of the school budget. So typically schools have a financial application or package that will enable them to manage the school's budget, but also payroll systems and accounts payable and accounts receivable systems. Those are usually separate standalone systems used in schools. Fourth type of data that is becoming increasingly prevalent in schools and also increasingly public is curricular data. So this would be things like standards, which are now widely available on the internet, the new New York State and new Common Core standards, as well as what are called curriculum maps, or sets of lessons and plans for achieving the standards, and even to the point of teachers posting specific lessons and assessments and projects online. That's all curricular data, which is quite a big area of data that's being collected and posted. And the last area was what I call operational data, and this is the kind of business side of the school district. This is things like bus routes and school lunches and facilities maintenance programs and things that run the heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems, all that kind of nuts and bolts, behind the scenes data that would be also required in any other business, but we're required to track that in school systems as well. So we'll take a look now at data security, and as I said, this is a huge topic, and especially given what's happened lately in the news. I'm sure you've heard of the numerous data breaches and all the concerns about data security in the commercial world. We have those same concerns in the school world, and I just wanted to touch really briefly on a couple of different ideas around data security and privacy. So first, let's start with talking about just a conceptual idea about how data is stored. And there's really two ways that data is stored. And one is what we call local, or on our physical servers in our school districts, and the other is what we call cloud. which is a bit of a misnomer because it's not really in a cloud, it's really in somebody else's facility on a physical server. What makes it cloud-based is that it's accessible from anywhere. So those two types of data storage practices, local and cloud, that typically in school districts, we have historically stored everything locally. So we would have often in a high school or in a district office, in larger districts, it might be a separate building where we'd have a data center with all our servers where all our data would be stored, hopefully a secure room that is climate controlled and protected. That's the typical way. School districts and businesses have been moving more towards the cloud-based solution, and a good example of that is Google Apps, which is very common now in schools and in the business world, where all of the data is stored in the cloud, which really just means it's stored on Google's physical server in Google's data center, and Google is responsible for security and electricity and air conditioning and backups. So that's an attractive feature, attractive solution for many school districts because on its face it eliminates a lot of costs. But obviously, when the data is physically located outside of our district, we do lose a little bit of security, and that's something that is a concern to many people. In talking about data security, there's a term that you need to be aware of, and the term is called rights. And when we're talking about data security, the idea of rights is when you log onto a computer, which files do you have access to? Which files does the computer network let you view and open and save and delete? And that idea is what's called rights. And one of the things that's very powerful about Google Apps and cloud-based systems is you can delegate rights to people so that I can store some data on a Google Apps account and let several or hundreds of people have rights to that file. And another concept that's related to that is sharing. I mean, this is where cloud services are very advantageous because when you have sharing, it allows people with rights to a file to access the file at the same time. And that's something that you typically cannot do on a local server. You can have rights to a file, multiple people can have rights to a file, but only one person can be accessing a file at one time. Whereas when it's on a cloud-based service like Google Apps, multiple people can be editing a file at the same time. So that's a big plus for cloud-based services. Another thing to keep in mind is redundancy. And in our local environment, we typically will have what are called mirrored servers or data backup. And mirrored server is just what it sounds like. For our most important servers, we would have a copy of the server either in another building or sometimes in the same building that is making a live copy of all the data, just as a precautionary backup. In the cloud-based solution, Google or any other vendor would do that for us, and their data is mirrored to multiple servers on their network. So that's an important thing to know. When we're talking about data security, we want to always make sure that our data is mirrored. And finally, the idea of availability and HAV, which is high availability, has become really, really important in schools. And it's interesting how this has evolved over the years. There was a time when we could go for a few days without email, or we could go for a couple of days without a file server in a school district, and that's no longer the case. And now the requirement for near 24/7 access and near 100% uptime has become pretty standard. And with that, we're looking at HAV solutions, high availability solutions, where not only is data mirrored, but data servers are set up in a way so that one can fail over to another one on the fly, meaning server A goes down, server B automatically kicks in, and all of our pointers to server A are redirected to server B seamlessly, so the user doesn't really see a difference. And that's the kind of thing that schools are increasingly being asked to implement because the demands for access to data are becoming more and more rigorous. And lastly, and most importantly, is the need for really a secure backup. It wasn't very long ago, probably 10 years ago when we were backing up using physical tapes. And I recall even being in districts where I was in charge of the backups, and I would take home tapes every Friday to my house, and just so that they were off site, and rotate through backup tapes like that, so that there was always a set of backup tapes off site. And when you think about that, if you think about that in the corporate world, what typically happens when people take data off site, you know that that's really not a good idea. But now that's not really done anymore, and tapes are kind of a thing of the past. Now we do what's called disk-to-disk backup, or D2D. And disk-to-disk is part of this whole mirrored server idea, where basically we're using hard drives to back up. Because the price of hard drives has come down so much over the years, we're using hard drives to back up data in real time, so that we have this kind of redundancy and a backup solution. And another option is what's called cloud-based backup, where we have our data on our local servers in our school district, but back it up to a cloud-based service. So every night, all of our data gets backed up to somebody else's server in some facility out of the state, out of the area, that's secure. And that's a great solution for schools, because it gives us a lot of security, a lot of redundancy, and it also makes sure that in the event of a disaster, our data is safely offsite at another location. Let's take a quick look at some of the different applications that are in use in school district. And the ones I'm going to be talking about are really kind of typical to New York State, and in particular the Lower Hudson Valley region. And that's just a factor of the demographics of this region, and also which applications are serviced by the local BOCES, and those tend to be the ones that get used the most in local school districts. So there's a couple of different categories of applications, and the first one is a Student Information System, or SIS. And the SIS is, for most districts, the largest, the most complicated, and the most expensive single application that they will use. The SIS is what tracks all of that student data that we talked about in the first or second slide. There's four big players in this region as far as student information systems. Infinite Campus is the biggest vendor around. PowerSchool is another big one, which was acquired by Pearson. eSchool Data and eSchool Plus have very similar names, similar products, but they are separate, and a lot of times they get confused. But they all pretty much will do the same thing. It's just a matter of different interface and different features, and the size of the companies. Some are public, some are private. But those applications tend to be the largest in terms of scope and cost in any school district. The second big application for data is what we call the New York State Data Warehouse. And as you may know, New York State has, over the past several years, has undertaken a huge data collection and reporting process, part of it related to Race to the Top, but much of it began even before that, where data is reported to the New York State Data Warehouse from school districts, typically going through the local BOCES to the New York State Data Warehouse. And that data warehouse functions with what are called levels, and this is kind of a conceptual framework. It's not like there's a physical divider, but level 0, level 1, and level 2 are the three steps in the data warehouse. Level 0 is at our BOCES. In our region, it's at the Lower Hudson Regional Information Center. And what happens in a school district is they will, every week or every few days, they will extract their data from their student information system, so Infinite Campus or PowerSchool or one of the others. They will extract a file, or many files, with student data, with assessment data, with demographic data, attendance data, and send that file to the New York State Data Warehouse, first to level 0, where it's processed and where some error checking is done. And after that error checking is done, the file is then sent to level 1, which is still at the BOCES. And then it goes to level 2, which is part of the New York State Data Warehouse. And that's also called the SIRS reporting system. So those three levels of data have become, for many districts, a very, very large undertaking as far as reporting data and ensuring data accuracy and compliance with New York State mandates. Talking a little bit more about data security and privacy, a couple of issues that need to be aware of, and some legislation that's very important. Obviously, FERPA, the Family Educational Rights Privacy Act, and COPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. Both of those have significant implications for school districts in terms of what we can and cannot do with data, and it's very, very much to your advantage to familiarize yourself with both of those acts because they do have ramifications for all of us as school administrators. In talking about data security, there's a few areas to consider, and the first one is physical space. So the physical space, when we're talking about locally stored data, so again, this is not the cloud solution, but locally stored data, the first thing, and probably the most important, is HVAC, heating, ventilation, air conditioning. And in the case of a data center, it's really air conditioning that is so important. As school districts add servers and equipment to their network operation centers, their heating load in those rooms goes up and up and up. And most schools were not built with these data centers in mind. Most schools, it's a closet or a classroom or an office that's been retrofitted, and it's really, really important that the air conditioning be adequate for those spaces. Otherwise, servers overheat, and there's a potential for data loss. Fire suppression, equally important in those rooms. The worst case scenario for a locally stored data center is a fire. And again, that's why that off-site cloud-based backup is so important, but we do want to have fire suppression in those rooms. And this is the kind of thing that is often overlooked, but very important in a proper data center. Access control, again, because these data centers are really an afterthought in most school districts, it's important to make sure those rooms are secure, that there's some sort of a identification verification system, whether it's a card swipe or a thumbprint scanner at the door, to allow only certain people access to the room and to control and to log who has access so that there's some accountability. And finally, and this is becoming more common, although it hasn't been in the past, the need for backup power for these data centers. We saw with several of the recent hurricanes significant power outages in the region, and without backup power, it's impossible to keep those data centers up and running. And those data centers have become critical for communication with parents and community in terms of making emergency phone calls and sending emergency emails. So backup power is something that's become very, very important in these data centers. And again, just to touch on some of the regulations that are important, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, those really protect student data, particularly health data that are stored in our student information systems, and it's very critical that access to that data be very closely monitored and controlled by school district staff. The Children's Internet Protection Act and the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act both deal with online access by minors, stipulating the age at which minors can access certain online content and the efforts that the school district must make to filter online content, both important aspects of managing data on a school network. Now touching on some instructional data applications, and we're going to talk about three different categories of applications, and the first one is a CMS, or Content Management System. Content Management System is typically what school districts use to manage their web presence, so their teacher websites and their school websites. And there tends to be a consolidation in this whole sector of the software market, and these companies keep getting bought by other companies, so there's not that many vendors out there offering these solutions. But Edline is a big one in this region. eChalk is very, very widely used in the southern Westchester, Lower Hudson Valley region, and Schoolworld, which was recently acquired by Edline, is still available as a separate product. These solutions allow district staff and teachers to manage websites very easily using a visual editor that doesn't require any specific coding, not any more difficult to use than shopping on Amazon, and it allows teachers to create web pages. It allows staff to update web pages very easily and very simply. most districts in our region certainly, and probably in most of the state, have some sort of a CMS in place now. The other important type of system is a learning management system, or LMS. And two examples of LMSs are Moodle and Blackboard. Moodle is an open source system. That means the code is freely available. It tends to be much less expensive. It can be done for free if you have technical staff to do it, or it can be done for a slight hosting fee. Blackboard is a commercial product. Both of those products you might have experienced in some of your online classes or courses with online components at the graduate level. Those are learning management systems that are designed to allow teachers to create online classes or supplement their real world classes with an online component. And they work very similar to a CMS in terms of being easy to manage, easy to use, requiring no special coding. Another system that's very prevalent in school districts is the OPAC, or Online Public Access Catalog. The OPAC is what we used to call years ago the card catalog. Those of you old enough to remember going to opening the physical drawers and sliding out the little index cards when you're looking for a book. That system, the card catalog, is a thing of the past, and it's all online now. The OPAC is the online catalog for school libraries, and the two big vendors in the area are Follett and Oasis, and those allow students to access their school libraries from home, from school, from tablets, laptops, smartphones, to search and reserve items from the collection. And lastly, talking about finance information, we talked about one of the types of data that is typically stored. Financial information is some of the most critical and important information in a school district. The big vendor in this region is called Finance Manager, and that application houses the district's budgeting components, payroll, accounts payable, accounts receivable, staff attendance, and a number of other functions related to the business end of the school district. Just to talk a little bit briefly about Finance Manager in a little bit more detail. So as I said, Finance Manager has a number of modules, and in those modules you can assign rights to allow different people to carry out different functions. Some of the modules are budgeting, payroll, requisitions to allow people to do purchase orders. There's a module to set up vendors. There's a module to pay staff and to pay vendors. And there's a module to receive payments, taxes, and payments in lieu of taxes. One of the things that's really important with financial systems, and it's become more important as the state has increased its scrutiny of school districts, is the ability to audit or track what people do. And Finance Manager and any of these financial applications maintain extensive audit logs of what people do. So really down to the click level. Anytime a user logs on to Finance Manager, what they do is tracked and logged so that reports can be provided to auditors or investigators if there's any suspicion of wrongdoing in the system. And Finance Manager relies heavily on rights, just like we talked about with file service rights. In Finance Manager, people have rights to specific applications and specific files and specific budget codes, and they do not have rights to others. And this is determined by the school business official, and this is something that auditors will look at very closely to make sure that people only have rights to the modules and the applications that they need for their job function. One of the worst things we can do is give people more rights than they need. And it's not to say that we don't trust people, but we just want to, it's really a way of protecting people to make sure that they don't have access to codes and modules that they don't use in their job function. Let's take a little bit of a deeper look at data reporting, back to that the New York State Education Department requirements. We have those three levels that I talked about earlier, level 0, 1, and 2 of data reporting. And then there's a whole nother level, which is the United States Department of Education, the federal education data reporting. Much of the data that goes through levels 0, 1, and 2 ends up going to the federal government through the New York State data system, but there is some data that we report as a school district directly to the federal government. and that is the Civil Rights Data Collection Project, or CRDC, which is a intermittent collection of data from school districts across the country on specific civil rights data, and they're looking for number of minority students attending taking certain courses. They're looking for ratio of students absence based on race. They're looking for any kind of red flags that indicate to them that a school district might have some sort of civil rights violation. And then, of course, title grants. So the federal government administers a number of title grants which school districts receive funding from. Some districts in our area receive very little, some receive more, but that data reporting goes directly to the federal government through the system's business office. Let's talk briefly about capital projects, and we're winding down the lesson for today, but capital projects are a very unique process for school district. It's very different than a building project in the commercial or private sector or residential for that matter. It's a very structured process, and there's some steps that have to go through that make it time consuming and a bit laborious, but it is pretty clear what the process is. It's just a matter of, as school business officials, following those steps and understanding the steps along the way. So the first step in a capital project for a school district, and when I say capital project, I mean anything from a new roof to a new school to a turf field to a new septic system to buying new computers, putting in new windows, putting in new doors, any sort of a facilities upgrade, replacement, or addition, that's considered as a capital project. The first step in a capital project is a proposal. The district needs to present a proposal, has to publicly discuss a proposal at the board level. Typically, school districts will hold community forums over a period of 2 to 6 months, depending on the scale and the scope of the project. And then that process culminates with a community vote. And the community will have to be presented with a referendum, and they will vote to authorize the school district to take out a bond and to complete the work that's been specified in the proposal. The next step is what's called a SECRA, or State Environmental Quality Review Act. And that is a state regulation that requires school districts and other organizations to submit a formal report to the state governing bodies indicating what, if any, environmental impact the project will have. And obviously, if a school district is putting in a new 5-acre parking lot, that's going to have a significant impact on water runoff and drainage and such in the area. If a school district is replacing their windows in a school, that's not likely to have much environmental impact. But regardless, for a capital project, the school district does need to submit a SECRA project approval to state ed to make sure that the state approves and that there's no environmental impact or acceptable environmental impact. Once that's been approved, the New York State Education Department will then approve the capital project. They have their own process. The latest I heard is that the process is taking from 20 to 24 weeks to be approved. So it is a time-consuming process, and school districts do need to think way in advance about these projects to get them approved way in advance of the typical summer construction period that they use. Once the state ed approves the project, there is typically state aid available depending on what the work is. The state will offer a building aid and construction aid, and it will vary based on the demographics of the district and the type of work that's being done. The school district will then need to finance the project. This is typically done through a commercial lender that will do a 10, 20, or 30-year bond. Depending on the projects. And one of the things that school districts are being asked to do is to make sure that the terms of the finance now match the life of the product. So for a 10-year, for a product with a 10-year life, like let's say replacing the computers in a building, school district would not want to take a 30-year bond because then they're going to be paying for those computers for 20 years after they're gone, and people tend to not like that. Whereas if they're building a new building that's going to last 50 years, then a 30-year bond makes a lot of sense because they'll be paying for it over a long period of time with smaller payments, and there'll be life after the bond is paid off. There'll still be life left to the product. And the last step of the capital project process is the implementation, which is the actual construction. School districts will typically, depending on the project, have a construction manager or a site manager that will be on site to manage all aspects of the project. In a smaller district or with a smaller project, the director of facilities, director of business, those folks might do more hands-on management of the project. Almost wrapping up now, I just want to touch on a few current issues that you may have heard of in the news, and these are things that really you can start to, if you're not already aware of, that you should be aware of in terms of public education in New York State in particular. The new requirements for annual professional performance review for teachers and principals. This is something that's been very contentious. There's been a lot of discussion, a lot of litigation about this in New York State. This is a new system that has come about after the awarding of $70 million to New York State from the federal Race to the Top grant. And this has huge implications for districts in terms of data security, and data privacy. Because what we're doing now is assigning a score of 0 to 100 points for each teacher and each principal in the school district. And that data is stored on the district servers and reported to the state of New York. And that's obviously something that needs to be closely guarded and very well secured to maintain the privacy and the confidentiality of that data. So privacy in general has become a huge issue in school districts, with a lot of parents now being concerned over some of the new initiatives from the state. And that's something that school districts need to be aware of in terms of student data in particular, and confidential student data. And social media has also, over the last 7 or 8 years, become quite a concern for school administrators, and something that school administrators need to really think about and be aware of in terms of protecting students from online dangers, but also providing them instruction and access to social media in an appropriate way. And finally, the issue of InBloom, which is the private data repository that the state of New York has hired to aggregate and distribute student data to third-party vendors. This has been in the news quite a bit lately, with a lot of parents objecting to the use of this, and this is still, the state is still planning to go forward with this, but it's still very much contentious, and we should be hearing more about this in the next few months. So those are some of the current issues that you might want to think about. And then I have a few resources. These are links in the PowerPoint where you can find out a little bit more information. So just about some of the current issues that I talked about is an article on APPR, and then an official memo from State Ed on APPR, an article about InBloom, the data portal, which is using InBloom's data, and some FERPA and HIPAA information. So that's the end of the presentation. I thank you for your attention. I hope the information presented was useful to you. Again, if you have any questions, you can certainly call or email me. I'm happy to answer specific questions. And thank you, and have a good day.